Welcome back, Highlanders, to the second lecture video for Chapter 14 and the final lecture video in our ascent up the macroeconomic mountain. So we are almost there. Remember where we left off last time? We were talking about the effects of that monetary policy. Remember that expansionary monetary policy can increase output and reduce unemployment in the short run, but in the long run is only going to lead to higher prices. Remember that restrictive monetary policy can reduce output or increase unemployment in the short run, but in the long run might only lead to those lower prices, right? And with that in mind, in order for this policy to be effective at stabilizing the economy, it has to be timed correctly. And according to Milton and Friedman, every major contraction in this country has been either produced by monetary disorder or greatly exacerbated by monetary disorder. Every major inflation episode has been produced by monetary expansion. So Milton Friedman is basically saying that the Federal Reserve and its misuse of monetary policy has either created or made worse every bad time in the country's history, and then every period of inflation is usually a result of that increase in money supply or that expansionary monetary policy. So why does the Fed have a hard time timing this correctly? Well, as it turns out, monetary policy suffers from all the same timing lags as fiscal policy. Hopefully you remember what those are, but in case you don't, remember that first we have to recognize where the economy is headed, and it can be very difficult for us to do that, as what we call the recognition lag, right? So again, we got to recognize that we're headed into a recession so that we can use that expansionary monetary policy to pull us out of that recession. At the same time, the Fed then has to decide exactly how they want to increase money supply and by how much, and that takes some time for them to figure that out, and that's what's known as the administrative lag. And then once they decide to increase money supply, that money supply has to work its way through the economy with the use of that whole money multiplier that we studied in the last chapter. That takes some time, and that is what we call the impact lag, right? So by the time we recognize where the economy is headed, by the time we've administrated the necessary changes, and by the time those changes have worked their way through the economy, then that restrictive monetary policy to slow down expansion, or that expansionary monetary policy to heat up that recession, right, might actually take effect at the wrong time. So our expansionary monetary policy might hit when the economy has already corrected itself or is back at full employment, and that's what's just going to create that long-run inflation. Or that restrictive monetary policy could actually hit while we're in the middle of that recession, and that's going to make that recession even worse. So let's take a look at some time periods throughout history where monetary policy has made the economy either enter a downturn or made that downturn worse. Right? I want to talk about some other things that happened during this time period as well. So I don't want to say that monetary policy is the only thing to blame, but it's certainly a contributing factor. So let's take a look at the Great Depression. So was this Great Depression caused by the stock market crash of 1929? And the short answer is probably, but in terms of the initial downturn, but the length and severity of the depression might have been caused by quite a few other factors. Right, so for those of you who don't know the history here, stock prices plunged from September through the end of October in 1929. So on September 3rd, 1929, the stock market was at an all-time high after a period called the Roaring Twenties, which is basically a huge expansion that happened during the 1920s. And remember, the bigger the expansion, usually the bigger the bust. And this bust happened September through October, culminating in a day known as Black Tuesday, which is on October 29th, 1929. And again, that was the biggest stock market crash in history up to that point. Now, what's interesting and what's rarely talked about is that the economy did recover during the 5 months from mid-November 1929 through mid-April of 1930. So the economy is kind of on its way back, right? But then something happened that usually doesn't happen is then it kind of crashed again and continued to stay down through the 1930s all the way up till the mid-1940s. And so a big question is why, right? This economy that's been moving in these waves or cycles all the way up till this point seemed to be staying down. Why is it staying down now where it didn't stay down before? Right, and so again, there are quite a few causes of the Great Depression that we're going to highlight here in terms of making it as long and severe as it was. And one of them was a mistimed contraction of the money supply. So the supply of money was expanding slowly and steadily through the 1920s, usually to keep up with the increase in goods and services. And remember, when we're talking about what we want an inflation rate to look like, we like to see that very slow, steady increase, right, rather than seeing those wild swings in the inflation rate. So in other words, the monetary policy during the 1920s seemed to be fairly appropriate, except the economy was really starting to boom and then becoming a little bit worried about the inflation that might result from this booming or roaring 1920s. Then the Fed decided that it was a good idea to increase the discount rate 4 times between January 1928 and August 1929 in an effort to use that restrictive monetary policy or slow down the economy. Remember, when the Fed increases the discount rate, they make it more expensive for those commercial banks to borrow money from them, and that means that banks will be less likely to borrow money from the Fed and less likely to extend loans, and that's one way that the Fed reduces or controls that money supply. So again, the Fed is charged with keeping inflation in check. They're thinking these 1920s have had a pretty ripe expansion, so what we really need to do now is start to slow the economy down. But again, it's hard to time this stuff correctly. They didn't know that the economy was kind of already headed for a recession when they started to implement this restrictive monetary policy. So again, they started to increase this discount rate right before this crash happened, which means that the actual impact of this policy probably took hold right during the middle of that crash. What's even worse, however, is that after the October stock market crash, the Fed then aggressively started selling bonds, which is another way that the Fed can reduce the money supply. So in other words, they continued to practice this restrictive monetary policy once we were already in a recession, probably because that was the plan before, and again, it takes a long time for these plans to change, right? So again, if you're already in a recession, then that restrictive monetary policy is going to make that recession even deeper by reducing that aggregate demand, right? So again, this mistimed monetary policy is certainly a potential culprit for making this depression as long as it was, right? If you want to take a look at what happened to the contraction of the money supply, you can see from this graph here, right? Again, money supply was kind of slowly and steadily increasing all the way up to about the mid to late 1920s, and then you start to see this little drop, but then it's slowly increasing again, and then another drop that ends up continuing. And then finally, they started increasing money supply in order to stimulate the economy, but then they dropped it again and then started increasing again. So what you do not see is that slow and steady increase in money supply necessary to hopefully keep inflation levels in check. What you see are wild swings in money supply. And where you see wild swings in money supply, again, this is just measured as our change in M1, right? So you can see the percent change in M1 is kind of swinging wildly. And that's going to make the change in prices swing wildly. And that's what you see here. So this is a change in the consumer price index. We talked about measuring that in Chapter 7, right? That's just our measure for our level of prices. As you can see, similar to what happened to money supply, prices follow, which is what the quantity theory of money says will happen. And again, you're going to see these massive or wild swings in the price level. And remember, these wild swings are things that are not usually associated with a strong economy. Right? Again, we want that inflation rate to be relatively low and stable. We don't want these wild swings in the inflation rate. That kind of monetary instability tends to make it hard to make decisions about how to invest in the future. Right? So again, we have the very opposite of what we need here for a productive economy, which is why the economy was so unproductive during this time period. Well, once again, I don't want to blame it entirely on monetary policy, although mismanaged monetary policy is definitely considered one of the causes of the Great Depression. Some other causes include the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was the largest trade restriction ever passed in this country's history. It increased tariffs by 50% on 3,200 imported items. Right? The idea being here that these economic times are so bad, what we need to do is get people to buy American-made products rather than buying products from overseas. Right? After all, if they make products made here in America by Americans for Americans, then that'll help get Americans back to work, and that'll help lift us out of this recession. However, what's usually forgotten about trade restrictions is that when you impose a tax or tariff against imported goods, right, people in other countries who are trying to sell goods to Americans don't like that, so they're going to pass retaliatory tariffs or essentially put taxes on any goods that are being exported to those countries from the United States. And indeed, that's what happened, right? So these other countries impose these retaliatory tariffs or put tariffs against the United States. Trade fell by more than 50%, and during this time, unemployment soared. It actually went up to 23.6% within 2 years of the Smoot-Hawley tariff passing. Another thing that happened during this time period is you had huge tax increases starting in 1931. the government eventually increased our top marginal tax rate, which is the tax bracket that the top earners in the country are in. So they increased it from 25% up to 79%. So it used to be for every extra dollar that's a wealthy person in the United States made, they have to pay 25% taxes on it. They increased that up to 79%, so that every dollar that a wealthy person made in the United States, or every extra dollar, they'd have to pay 79 cents in taxes. They'd only get to keep 21 cents of it. Right. If you want to see a graph of what that huge tax increase looks like, there it is. Right. So it went from in 1931 from 25% all the way up to 63%, right? And then again increased it in 1936 all the way up to 79%, right? So again, that's the top marginal tax earners, but even the lowest tax earners in the United States also faced a tax increase, although a much smaller one, right? So in other words, taxes were increased on everybody, giving people less of an incentive to work and earn money. After all, if you're a rich person who is going to start a business or open up a new factory in order to kind of expand your production, you're certainly not going to do it if the government starts taking 79 cents of every dollar you earn, especially during an economically uncertain time. You're probably like, I'm not going to risk my assets and start that factory if I don't even get to keep most of what I earn. So that's one reason why, again, production would stay down during this time period, and unemployment got as high as 25% eventually when these tax laws were increased. All right. So again, this is a situation that Milton Friedman was talking about, where monetary policy made a depression worse. You combine that with a huge trade restriction, which we know is bad. We talked about how free trade or voluntary exchange is a good thing back in Chapter 2, as well as a huge tax increase, which reduced the incentive to produce. And then the final thing that happened during the Great Depression was you had a lot of price controls, regulations, and constant policy changes. And it's hard to have a strategy for how you're going to improve your own life and improve the economy when the rules are constantly changing. And that was one thing that was happening during this time period. So I'll give you a couple examples of these regulations or policy changes. One of which is the government instituted what is called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA Act, and that was adopted in 1933 under that Roosevelt administration as part of the New Deal. And what they basically tried to do here is push prices up by restricting the supply of agricultural products. So farmers came to the government and lobbied hard for a policy like this, saying, hey, we're having trouble selling our products for enough money. The monetary policy, again, has caused prices to go down. And if you're somebody who sells something, then that's trouble for you. You're not able to make as much money as you were before. So these farmers go to the government and say, hey, we're not able to sell our products for as much money anymore. Is there anything you can do to help us raise our prices and allow us to make more money? So what the government does is they say, well, we can give you taxpayer dollars to destroy food and your agricultural products in an effort to raise the price of them. After all, if you restrict supply, prices go up. And so that's what they did, is they paid farmers to do things like spray their crops with this purple dye, making them unfit for consumption, or prematurely slaughter about 6 million baby pigs before they could grow up and have their pork sold out on the market, right? And again, if we reduce the number of products that are out there on the market, then we're going to increase our prices and allow them to sell these products for more money. So the farmers were getting paid to destroy the crops, and then they're going to make extra money from selling their products at higher prices. At least that was the idea. Unfortunately, it doesn't take a genius to understand that a policy designed to use taxpayer dollars to destroy food at a time when people are starving to death in an effort to raise prices when people don't have any money isn't necessarily a good policy. In fact, it was declared unconstitutional within a couple years, and that policy went by the wayside. Another policy that was passed was the National Industrial Recovery Act, and this is basically the government saying, all right, maybe the problem is all these industries are competing with one another, right? So what we're going to do is try to eliminate this competition, right? So they organized more than 500 industries into cartels, which essentially says you're now not only allowed to work together, but you are required to work together in an effort to reduce competition between you. And as we talked about, competition is good for spurring innovation or creating that economic growth. You get rid of that competition and you get rid of that need or desire to innovate and keep your customers happy and your prices low. So government got together with business leaders and they set production quotas, telling every company this is how much you're allowed to produce. These are the prices you're allowed to charge. These are the wages you're allowed to pay. These are the working hours you're allowed to have. And here are the distribution methods that you're allowed to have for each industry. If you don't comply with this, then you are going to be thrown in prison. Right. So this was a pretty strict control that, again, reduced competition and kind of force these industries to work together and organize into what are known as cartels, which are essentially organized monopolies. Now, if you want to take a look at the effect of the National Industrial Recovery Act, right, that was passed in around midsummer or July 1933. And what's interesting is you can see from April to July of 1933, right, you can see that production was increasing. And again, the economy seemed to be kind of rebounding a little bit. But then the National Industrial Recovery Act was passed. And again, without this competition stimulus and with these organized regulations or monopolies, right, then you are now going to see that production goes down. And it never, ever rebounds past its pre-NIRA level until it's declared unconstitutional, right, in around May of 1935. So right around this time period here is declared unconstitutional. And as you can see, once it is declared unconstitutional, it starts to go up and eventually exceeds its pre-NIRA level, right? So again, we measure this as the index of industrial production. And as you can see, that was as high as it was going to get for a while when that NRA was passed. That caused that industrial production to go down until, again, that policy was also declared unconstitutional and was eliminated. And then we started to actually produce again to a point where it increased that industrial production level before the NRA was passed. So as you can see, this policy devastated the economy and reduced production during this time period, right? So again, you combine these policies with the monetary instability, and you can see why the Great Depression was as bad as it was, right? It's a combination of some bad policies in an effort to fix the economy, along with that monetary instability caused by some timing problems with the Fed. All right, now let's take a look at a more recent economic crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, also known as the Great Recession, because while it was a bad economic time, it was still nowhere near as bad as the Depression was. And there are 4 causes of this, the first of which are regulations that lowered mortgage lending standards or made it too easy for people to get a loan. People who probably shouldn't have been getting loans for homes were starting to get loans. You combine that with, again, some mistimed monetary policy from the Fed, and you're going to create a bubble and burst in the housing market. And that burst was particularly bad given that we have some increased debt to capital ratio of lending institutions, and also you have high and growing debt to income ratio of American households during this time period. Right. So let's kind of talk about how these 4 causes work together to create a perfect storm for an economic crisis. All right, so we have these government-sponsored enterprises known as GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. If you ever heard Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the news, no, those are not people. Those are companies that were sponsored by the government. So again, these are kind of private for-profit companies that were started by the government and has a lot of interaction with government officials, right? So people who would go to work or run these companies are people who were at one time senators or congressmen and vice versa, right? So again, there's kind of some potential scandalous interplay between these particular companies and the government, right? Now, the Department of Housing and Urban Development is a organization within the government that's at this time period was trying to get people to buy homes, particularly those people who were considered poor or lower middle income. And the reason why is because it's often viewed that what separates a really wealthy person from somebody who's not so wealthy in this country is that home ownership. Because if you spend 20 years paying rent, at the end of that 20 years, you don't have anything to show for it. If you spend that same 20 years buying, say, a $300,000 home, then at the end of that 20 years, you have a home that is worth at least $300,000, but probably more than that given increase in real estate prices. Right. So again, the difference between somebody who's renting and somebody who's buying is the value of that home, which it could be at least $300,000. Right. So saying one way that we can reduce income inequality and really help poor people in the United States is give incentives to give loans to poor people so they can go out there and buy these homes. Again, it's a good idea with good intentions that is has some secondary effects or some bad outcomes that causes good intentions to lead to those outcomes that we didn't really care for or hope would exist. So Department of Housing and Urban Development, being a government entity, again, has a strong relationship with these government-sponsored enterprises. And they basically told Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that we really want you to extend loans to low and moderate income households, right? Basically, they set some requirements for them, saying that in 1996, so by 1996, right, the requirement was 40% of all your loans have to go to people below a certain income level. And that was actually increased by the year 2000. It was 50% of your loans have to go to people below a certain income level. And then by 2008, when the crisis really began, or when stuff hit the fan there, it was up to 56% of your loans have to go to people below a certain income level. Again, an effort to help poor people get a mortgage and start establishing equity in a home. Right. Now, it can be hard to extend loans to people below a certain income level because usually to get a mortgage loan, you need like a 20% down payment, and you also need a good credit history. And people who are below, people who have low incomes are people who often don't have the savings that of that down payment required to get a mortgage. And also people who sometimes have bad or incomplete credit histories, right? So with that in mind, in order to meet these targets, right, these companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, had to essentially give loans to people who they wouldn't otherwise give loans to. In other words, they no longer required a 20% down payment or a good credit history for you to get a mortgage loan. You can get a mortgage loan with little to no down payment or with a bad or incomplete credit history. Right. The Community Reinvestment Act is also a policy that was passed that helped push banks to extend loans to what we now call high-risk borrowers, or people who have again, little to no down payment or a bad or incomplete credit history. So again, these regulations tend to lower lending standards, and so in order to understand how, I need to kind of make you equip you with some definitions here. So one of which are called subprime loans, and these are loans made to borrowers with a blemished credit history. So people who might have declared bankruptcy in recent history, or people who have bad credit due to late payments, or again, maybe there are people who have moved around a lot or have a lot of hits on their credit score, things that tend to make people's credit scores lower, right? So again, these people are, so these loans are going to people who, again, might otherwise have a harder time getting loans. That's why they're called subprime loans, right? And then another type of loan is called an Alt-A loan, and these are loans extended to borrowers with a poorly documented credit history. So people who don't necessarily have bad credit, but people who might have no credit, or people who have holes or gaps in their credit history, that usually raises red flags among lenders to the point where they might, again, otherwise have a hard time getting a loan. So again, in order to meet these targets, these government-sponsored enterprises started extending a lot of loans to people with bad credit histories or people with incomplete credit histories. So the percentage of all loans that were subprime or Alt-A loans started to increase. And we can see that here. So again, this green line represents the subprime loans. The red line represents subprime and Alt-A loans when added together. And as we can see, this is the share of mortgages originated. So basically the share of all loans as a percentage. You can see that the subprime and the subprime plus Alt-A loans started to really increase to the point where at its height, you had about 1/3 of all mortgage loans being loans going to people with either a bad or an incomplete credit history, right? In other words, about 1/3 of all loans are these potentially dangerous loans, right, that could turn quite toxic if the economy were to turn around. Right? So you have that going on here. Now, while you have that going on here, the Fed is conducting some low interest rate policy or using expansionary monetary policy to kind of help pull the economy out of a economic downturn. Right, so for those of you who weren't alive at this time, or for maybe those of you who barely remember, in 2001, we experienced some terrorist attacks on September 11th, right, when some planes were flown into that World Trade buildings, right, and as a result of those terrorist attacks, you had a recession because people were afraid to travel, right, people were kind of uncertain about what was going to happen in the future. So you had a kind of a short economic downturn in 2001 following those terrorist attacks. So the Fed's like, all right, so we need to stimulate the economy. And one way we're going to do that is, again, by increasing money supply and keeping interest rates low. So that was a policy that they kept hold of from 2002 through 2004, right, again, to help stimulate the economy out of that recession. Now, what these low interest rates do is they increase the attractiveness of what's called an adjustable rate mortgage. And for those of you who plan to own your own home one day and get a mortgage, the safest mortgage to get is what is known as a fixed rate mortgage, right? You might want to stay away from those adjustable rate mortgages because how those work is that when interest rates are low, then the interest rate you pay on your mortgage is low. That's going to make your housing payments low. But if those interest rates go back up, then the interest rate that you pay on your mortgage goes up, and that's going to make your mortgage payments a lot higher. Right, so again, you've got poor people with bad credit histories and no down payment are now being advertised these adjustable rate mortgages. So these lenders or banks are saying not only do you not need a down payment and not only do you not need a good credit history, but right now with interest rates so low, you might be able to afford that, say, $400,000 house that you didn't think you could afford because of these low interest rates. Your housing payments are going to be pretty low. However, the Fed also is worried about keeping inflation in check. So again, they push these interest rates back up in 2005 and through 2006 to try to combat that inflation. And when those interest rates go up, that's going to make those adjustable rate mortgage payments go up. So now these people who were sold these mortgages, who are thinking they can make these monthly payments, even though they didn't have a lot of money or good credit, are now stuck making much higher payments that they can no longer afford. Right, and as a result, started to default on these loans. Right, so here's a look at the low interest rate policy of the Fed. Right, so again, if you're looking at the interest rate as a percent, whether it be the federal funds rate or the T-bill interest rate, you can see that again when those terrorist attacks happened in September 11, 2001. Right, you can see that the Fed drastically lowered those interest rates and kept them low through 2004. And then again, around 2004, 2005, started to increase those interest rates again. So during this period, this is where the adjustable rate mortgages or ARM loans are particularly attractive. And so you have a lot of poor people, again, with no savings for a down payment and not very good credit, taking out these huge mortgages because they're told that they could afford them as long as interest rates stayed low. But then when interest rates start to go up again, now those payments aren't low anymore. Those payments increase with those interest rates, right? So this is when the default and foreclosure rates are going to start increasing. And we'll talk about those differences between default and foreclosure here in a second. All right. So when interest rates on adjustable rate mortgage loans increase, so did these foreclosure rates for both subprime and prime loans. So again, just to make sure that we are familiar with the definitions, when we talk about the mortgage default rate, that's when that's the rate at which people are late making their mortgage payments. But when we're talking about the actual foreclosure rate, that's the rate at which the bank has started the process of taking the home back from the person who is paying that mortgage due to non-payment. So in other words, when we're talking about foreclosure rates, we're talking about the percentage of people who are actually losing their homes here, right? And that rate usually stays relatively small, right? Usually somewhere between maybe 1 or 3% at the most, right? Whether you're talking about fixed or adjustable rate mortgages. But remember, now we're in a period where a lot of these mortgages, about 1/3 of them, are going to people who have no down payment and a bad credit history. And a lot of these mortgages are now adjustable rate mortgages, which again, when the Fed increases that interest rate, is going to increase the payments that these individuals below this income level now have to start paying. Right. So again, when the payments go up, these people are going to start experiencing these mortgage defaults and then eventually these foreclosures. So as you notice, this percent here is really starting to increase drastically during this time period, right, in which the Fed has pushed up this interest rate, again, pushing up the price of these housing payments. And this is true for both subprime and prime loans when it comes to adjustable rate mortgage. Notice that the fixed rate mortgages are largely unaffected by this increase in interest rates because, again, fixed rate mortgages, you're paying the same mortgage payment, you're making the same mortgage payment every month, regardless of what happens with the interest rate. So again, this might be the safer mortgage to get if you decide to get a mortgage or buy a house in your future. So if you look at the subprime loans and you look at the prime loans, the story is the same, right? The fixed rate mortgages aren't really changing, but the adjustable rate mortgages are going up when that interest rate policy of the Fed goes up, or when they use that expansionary monetary, when they use that restrictive monetary policy to reduce money supply and increase the interest rate. Those payments on those adjustable rate mortgages are increasing to the point where it is causing foreclosure rates to go up. Now, as you notice, foreclosure rates are still going up here, but if you notice this percent change is a lot smaller. We aren't talking about going from 1% up to 5 or 6%. We're talking about going from, say, 0.4% up to, say, maybe just 1% when it comes to prime loans. Again, these are the safer loans going to people who have a good credit history and people who have that 20% down payment, right? So again, the people who are going to be hit hardest by this are those poor individuals below that income level that we are trying to help the most with these policies that eventually cause these lending institutions to extend more loans to these individuals than they otherwise would. So now for the first time, the group of people we're trying to help the most are the group of people who are hurt the most by a well-intended policy. Now, also what's happening during this time period that's going to lead to the collapse of these financial institutions are the increased debt to capital ratio that banks are carrying. Right, so in 2004, the SEC or Security Exchange Commission regulations allowed banks to leverage their capital and extend more loans. So remember that the Federal Reserve is in charge of setting the reserve requirement for banks and lending institutions, saying here's how much you have to keep on hand versus how much you're allowed to loan out. And again, if they want the banks to extend more loans or use this expansionary monetary policy, then one thing they're going to do is lower those reserve requirements, allow them to keep less money on hand and extend more loans as they see fit. Well, again, there tends to be a lot of interaction between the Federal Reserve and the government. So as part of this policy to help poor people get into homes, right, the Fed really started to try to incentivize this by allowing banks to extend more loans, particularly if they're residential loans. So the way this works is if these banks wanted to extend what we call commercial loans, this would be like loans to start a business, then the required rate was 8%, which means that banks had to hold on to 8% of deposits and they could loan out 92%. Right. However, again, we're trying to get people in the homes here, right? So what they did was say, all right, if you start to extend residential loans, right, then you have to only hold on to 4% of your deposits, right? So in other words, as long as you're extending money for homes in terms of what we call these residential loans, then we're going to change it so that you only have to hold on to 4% and you can loan out as much as 96% of those deposits, right? And if you can bundle these residential loans together to make them safer, after all, there's maybe a big risk of one person defaulting or going into foreclosure on their mortgage, but there's a lower risk of, say, multiple people doing it. So if you can bundle all these mortgages together in what's called a AAA-backed security, then you only have to hold on to 1.6% of your deposits, and you can loan out the other 98.4%, right? So with that in mind, what do you think banks are going to do? Well, they're going to start extending more of these residential loans, and they're going to start bundling these loans together into these AAA mortgage-backed securities, because ultimately banks want to make money, and they don't make money by sitting on your money. They make money by extending loans with it, right? So banks bundle mortgages together into these AAA securities, and AAA were supposed to indicate that these securities were relatively safe, and historically they are. Right, when you bundle a bunch of mortgage securities together, or mortgage loans together, they tend to be relatively safe because, one, people don't want to be homeless, so they usually want to pay their mortgages on time, and it's very rare that you're going to have multiple people default or foreclose. Again, you might just have a few people do it, but usually not a lot. So again, if you can bundle these together, right, most people are going to be able to pay back those loans, whereas maybe just a few people default, and overall the security is going to make money. However, now you're talking about a time, again, where a third of these loans are going to people with little to no down payment and bad or incomplete credit histories. In other words, these mortgage-backed securities were much more toxic than they usually are because, again, of these well-intended policies established by the government, right? So when these securities started to default, as, again, all these individuals had trouble making their housing payments on their adjustable rate mortgages when those interest rates went up, then these investment banks that were highly leveraged or had most of their money in these AAA securities, again, incentivized to do so by these SEC regulations, right? Then you saw these banks really started to collapse, and you started to see the fall of these financial institutions, right? So again, it's kind of a perfect storm of things coming together, right, to lead to the collapse of these banks, as well as people then kind of end up upside down in their homes or end up in not being able to pay their mortgages. All right, now the fourth and final thing that was happening is the high and growing debt to income ratio of American households, right? So for whatever reason, people have kind of gotten driven into this consumer culture where they're spending a lot more and saving a lot less, and this debt to income ratio of households has risen sharply since the early 1980s. Right, so at the time that this crisis happened, you can see that the debt to disposable personal income ratio, or debt to income that people have after paying taxes, right, is really starting to increase. So back in the 1950s, you might only had a 40% debt to income ratio, meaning that of your after-tax income per year, you might only have 40% of that in debt. So if you make $100,000 a year after taxes, you might only have like $40,000 in debt. That includes what you owe on like your student loans, what you owe on your credit cards, what you owe on your mortgage or your housing loan, right? Now, when we got up to 2008, as it turns out, people were carrying an average of close to about 130 to 135% on their debt to disposable personal income ratio, meaning that if they were to make, say, $100,000 a year in after-tax income, then they would owe $130,000 in terms of again, their mortgages or their student loans or their credit cards or things like that. So people are carrying a lot higher debt than is usually the case. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, your mortgage and home equity loans are tax deductible. And so the interest rate that you pay on your mortgage payments, right, you can deduct that from your tax bill. Right, but other forms of debt aren't tax deductible. So in other words, the interest rate that you pay on, say, your credit card isn't tax deductible. So most household debt is concentrated in housing assets, meaning that the biggest portion of people's debt are in their homes. Right, that's where people owe the most money is on their mortgages. And this is, of course, no more true than what was happening during this financial crisis. So when the value of their homes fall and they're unable to make these mortgage payments, right, then the housing market is going to be hit especially hard when these economic conditions started to weaken, right? So again, this is a reason why you had this housing crisis at the same time that you had this financial crisis, right? Again, people were just taking out mortgages that were way too big, partly again because they were encouraged to do so through these government regulations, and again, the Fed's mistiming of monetary policy, right? But also because we have kind of gotten into a culture where we're just comfortable carrying around a lot more debt, right? So people weren't worried about having a 20% down payment. They were taking out or weren't as worried about getting homes that they knew they could afford. They were getting bigger houses than what they could afford with little to no down payment, and again, bad credit histories. And as you can imagine, this is a recipe for disaster. So that's kind of what led up to this financial crisis and why it happened. Right, and that's it for this chapter, and the class for that matter. So know why the money demand curve is downward sloping, or why there's an inverse relationship between the nominal interest rate and the amount of money that people want to hold. Again, when I say hold, I mean actually keep on them physically versus in the bank. At higher interest rates, they usually want to put money in the bank, so they want to hold less. At lower interest rates, right, they don't care as much about putting money in the bank, so they're going to hold more. And you know why the money supply curve is vertical? Because money supply is set by the Federal Reserve and does not depend at all on those interest rates. Know the effect of expansionary and restrictive monetary policy and how it increases and decreases aggregate demand respectively. So know how expansionary monetary policy increases aggregate demand, right? We talked about the three ways, right? Remember that expansionary monetary policy is going to lower interest rates. That's going to increase consumption. That's going to increase investment. It's also going to cause capital inflows to go down. And when capital inflows go down, then that's going to cause the dollar to depreciate, which is going to cause net exports to go up. It's also going to cause asset prices to go up. That's going to get people more optimistic about the economy. Those three things are going to combine to increase aggregate demand. Now, if we use restrictive monetary policy or reduce money supply, that's going to cause interest rates to go up. That's going to cause consumption and investment to go down, right? That's going to cause capital inflows to go up, which will cause the dollar to appreciate. That's going to cause net exports to go down, right? And that's also going to cause asset prices to go down, so people are more pessimistic about the economy. That's all going to decrease aggregate demand. So you know how those channels work in terms of how monetary policy affects aggregate demand. Also know the implications of the quantity theory of money, and that says that when money supply goes up, then prices are going to go up, or inflation is going to happen, all else constant, right? So if we double the money supply, again, everything else staying the same, then you're going to double prices or increase the inflation rate. Also know the effect of monetary policy in both the short run and in the long run. Remember that expansionary monetary policy in the short run can increase employment or reduce the unemployment and can increase our output, but in the long run is just going to lead to higher prices. And again, we have to time it correctly, or else it's going to reduce economic stability rather than increase it. And be familiar with the causes of the Great Depression that we talked about in class. Again, it might have been the initial onset, might have been that stock market collapse, but it was certainly helped along by that restrictive monetary policy that happened both before and after that stock market crash. In addition to some misguided monetary policy, you also had the biggest trade restriction in United States history with that Smoot-Hawley tariff. You also had huge tax increases, which reduced the incentive to produce, and you had a lot of price controls and regulations and policy changes happening, right, that were bad for production. All right, and then be familiar with the causes of the financial crisis of 2008, also known as the Great Recession. Remember, you had regulations that lowered mortgage lending standards, coupled with some prolonged interest rate policy by the Federal Reserve, or some mismanaged monetary policy there, right? Combine that with this high debt-to-capital ratio of lending institutions, and then a higher debt-to-income ratio of American households, and you have a recipe for an economic disaster. All right, so that is it for Chapter 14, and that is it for the class. So congratulations, you have reached the top of the macroeconomic mountain, right? We've ascended all the way to the summit, right? Started from the bottom, now we're here. Congratulations on your journey to the top. I'm glad to have, glad you made it, and I'm proud and honored to have been your guide on this particular journey. As always, if you have any questions about anything, please let me know and I'll be happy to answer them. You can come visit me in those Zoom office hours, or you can just shoot me an email, right? So again, finally, it's been a pleasure and an honor teaching you all this quarter. I know it can be disappointing for some of you that we've had to do this class online versus face-to-face. I can certainly understand why. Just rest assured that I covered everything in this online class that I would cover in a face-to-face class, so you didn't really lose out on any information or knowledge that you otherwise would have gained. We just had to deliver it through a different medium. That said, I hope you enjoyed the class. Once again, I enjoy teaching it, and I hope you continue to stay safe and healthy. If this is our last economic journey together, then I wish you all the best in achieving your future academic and professional goals. It's been real. Take care.